have ample opportunity for people to make comments and ask questions if they need to. We only have one presentation from PG&E today. Just doing a quick recap of where we've been. We've been discussing need determination, the seasons, slices. There have been informal comments submitted. The informal comments have interestingly broken down, it seems to be somewhat 50-50 between support for Edison's proposal and support for PG&E's proposal on how to break up the slices. And there seems to be a pretty strong split, if I'm reading it correctly, between the people who pay for load seeming to favor SCE's proposal to try and keep costs down, and merchant generators seemingly on PG&E's side. Anyways, I just thought that was an interesting thing that I noticed in reading over the many great comments submitted. So without further ado, let's go ahead and turn it over to PG&E. And we'll go from there.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks, Alan. This is Peter Griffiths from PG&E. Luke, can you project?
Yeah, hopefully everyone can see that.
Yeah, I can see it. So thank you, Luke, for putting that up. This is the, I guess this is the fifth in a series of workshops. The next to this workshop and the next workshop are focusing on the need determination and allocation. And we will be speaking to that in both workshops. There's ample opportunity for conversation today. A lot of what I think we'd like to talk about today is putting things together and how things need to fit together in this type of a framework or in an RA framework. So Luke, let's go to the next slide. Generally, I want to start with a little safety message. This is a fairly standard slide that PG&E uses, but it tries to cover sort of all aspects of safety and what we need to be thinking about, including sort of, we all live in earthquake country. Earthquakes do happen, and so I think we all have a pretty good idea of what the earthquake drill is. We're all working remotely and have very, very different situations in terms of where we are and how we're doing things and what we're doing. Fire is a possibility. I think we all need to know how to get out and where to get out and what to do in that case. And one of the things I wanted to spend a little bit more time on to some degree is a medical emergency. Generally, I don't know how many people are working alone or by themselves. But this chat is, or this call for the most part is a connection to the outside world. Should you be alone and need some help, certainly we are monitoring the chat and can try and essentially provide some assistance if necessary, if something should be needed by anyone. So with that, let's move to sort of the next slide. We have been starting with the principles. These are the CPUC principles that they laid out in the decision laying out the workshops. And I'm not going to read through them. I think we're all very comfortable with them and what those are. And so, it's really very much a balancing act between looking at sort of getting reliability and cost. It's balancing between making sure that we've got sufficiency in all hours versus making sure we're advancing environmental goals. It's balancing sort of the granularity of meeting the hourly needs and simplicity of being able to transact and have a transaction-based way of doing it. And importantly, implementation. We don't want to design anything that's too complex that can't be implemented in a time frame that makes sense. And finally, durability. Durability is important in terms of making sure that we're not just thinking about what the immediate needs are or the needs in the RA system in the next 2 or 3 years, but we're thinking along down the road as to how the system could change going forward. The next slide, please. The way sort of, and so what we want to do sort of our key objectives sort of in the need and determination and allocation and the discussion. We want to make sure that we're looking at and thinking about the over or under procurement risk. Over procurement risk to some degree means that we're buying too much, we're getting too much reliability, and we're spending too much money. Under procurement risk for the most part means that we are essentially not buying enough to be able to cover some contingencies that may be needed and maybe things that need to be covered. So there's a greater risk of there being outages with under procurement. So we need to make sure that we have sort of, we're mindful of that, and we're mindful to some degree of how that is showing up in the system that we set up. Administrative complexity. The one thing that we want to make sure that we aren't creating too complex of a system that will be too difficult to implement on the time frame that the Commission has requested that it be implemented. And so there needs to be a reasonable amount of administrative effort in administering whatever the program is that we're putting up. We're also concerned about fair cost allocation, sort of what the approach is, needs to make sure that the LSEs that are causing the cost are the ones who are bearing the cost, or at least that the responsibility is following those that are putting burdens on the system. And finally, we want to make sure there's alignment across proceedings. And there has been talk in these discussions about what the IRP is doing and how the IRP is working, and how that coordination should be taking place. That is something that is mindful. I think that has to be, to some degree, a dialogue between what's going on in the RA proceeding and how the RA system works, and what's going on in the IRP system, and what the IRP is doing and how the IRP is moving forward. We're going to talk a little more about that and sort of how we see some of that process working, or at least how PG&E sees some of that process working going forward. Luke, let's go to the next slide. One of the things I wanted to do and have a discussion and make sure that people understand is that the approach that we've been taking has been talking about various aspects of the RA structure and focusing in on them, and talking about what some of the choices are and how some of those choices might play. But it's all a single structure. And so one of the things that we need to be aware of is that when we make a choice in one area, say in the number of slices or the number of seasons, that has implications for meeting reliability. If we make a decision there, that has implications for other aspects, resource counting. We spent a couple of workshops talking about resource counting and how resources should count. And then for the most part, we're going to talk about what the need determination is today. And all of those pieces essentially fit together to be able to provide an RA program that essentially gets to the level of reliability that is desired. The level of reliability, for the most part, is a measure of the loss of load of expectation of the LOLE. We've had some discussion about that. And that, for the most part, is sort of what the target is, and sort of the parameters that go into what the structure is, how the structure is set up, how resources are counting, how needs are determined, and how needs are set up. All of those things go together to basically having an impact or a determination on, are we meeting or are we not meeting essentially the level of reliability that we're trying to shoot for. So all of these things are fitting together. So let's, Luke, let's go to the next slide. The season and slice structure, the resource counting, setting requirements and LSC allocation, which we're going to talk about today some, and also the planning reserve margin, we're going to talk about today some. All of these pieces are key pieces in being able to make sure that we get to the level of reliability and make sure that the level of reliability that is set is what we desire, and it works together. So all of these things, for the most part, have an impact, and it's important for us to understand sort of what sort of impact each of these things has and how they fit together. So the season and slice structure, we started out talking about season and slices. We talked about what some of the options were. We've talked about various seasonal aspects of things. We've talked about different sizes of slices, whether they be a 4-hour slice or a 1-hour slice. We've talked about different seasons and different configuration of seasons. For the most part, in setting the requirements, and the reason why season and slices are important is because they determine at what level and how the requirements are going to be set for whatever that showing period is, whether it be a season, whether it be a season with a particular slice configuration. It's that configuration to some degree that has an impact. We've seen for the most part that the 24 slice per monthly structure has been one that has been put forward. That is certainly one that is very viable and can work. That structure for the most part very closely meets load. However, that structure essentially targets load and targets load sort of in meeting it in each hour. By going to a slice structure that's longer than an hour and a season which is longer than a month, what you're doing is you're putting together hours to determine a single requirement that would be applicable for all of those hours. And so those hours are not all going to be exactly alike. And so part of the issue and part of what we're trying to strive for the most part is, are we getting the right type of hours together and have them be to some degree somewhat homogeneous in terms of being able to be reflective of what the needs are on the system at that particular configuration of slice and season. And so it isn't a perfect match. I mean, we've seen analyses that show that an hourly framework essentially gets to hitting each hour, and so that when you put hours together in a slice, you're to some degree have an impact because you're basically letting 1 hour in that slice essentially set the requirements for all hours in that slice, and that can basically mean that you're putting things together in a way that essentially you're procuring perhaps too much in some hours, particularly if you're doing it on a maximum basis for the hours in that slice. And so the configuration has an impact, and the configuration to some degree, you could be essentially building in a cushion or a buffer for a number of hours, depending upon what that configuration of season and slice is. So that if I've got a 4-hour slice instead of a 1-hour slice, that 4-hour slice essentially, I've got 1 hour that's setting the requirement for that entire slice for all of those hours, and that might be too high. But it's also essentially setting a cushion for those hours. And that cushion to some degree may well be important when we start thinking about uncertainty and how we're dealing with uncertainty, particularly in planning reserve margin. So that's one of the trade-offs and one of the things that we're sort of in thinking about sort of how the season and slice structure fits together is one component. Another component for the most part is resource counting and what the trade-offs are in sort of how resources should count and what they should count for in meeting the requirement. The resources, for the most part, in operation are going to show up at whatever they're designed to do at whatever values. The question is how much of that do we need to discount, or should we be discounting for particular purposes? How much of that resource is actually going to be able to contribute to essentially meeting load in a particular season and slice? And we've talked about various ways of doing that, whether it's in exceedance, whether it's with ambient D-rates, with it's that sort of thing. For the most part, what we're trying to do in this slice of day is really very much match the capability of the resource in the particular time frame in terms of a slice and season with essentially what it can actually output. And the question is that output is variable, and how do we handle that? Or can be variable, and how do we handle that with resources that have forced outages? Certainly, using UCAP is one way to be able to handle that type of an issue. Also, with levels of exceedance for essentially renewable resources is another way. And so how we determine what the exceedance is or how the resources can count will then have an impact on sort of, okay, how much of a discount and how much of a cushion am I building in essentially on the resource counting and how the resources count in terms of making sure that I've got enough to meet load in any particular hour. Setting requirements is sort of the third. We're going to talk more about that today. We're going to talk more about sort of load forecasting and how load forecasting works, whether it be a 1 in 2 load forecast or a 1 in 5 load forecast or a 1 in 10 load forecast. The level at which you're setting the requirement in terms of load also has an impact on the probability that you may or may not have enough resources to essentially meet that level of demand. If I set it at a 1 in 2, I'm pretty much saying, okay, half of the time I think my load is going to be higher than what I'm actually shooting for in terms of having enough for. On the other hand, if I set it at a higher level, say a 1 in 5, I'm setting it at a higher percentile so that there's more of that distribution of load that I think can be met in the program and that the program is procuring to. So load does have, and how load is taken into account also has an impact very much on the level of reliability. And sort of how the allocation is done and whether it's, how are we determining what those requirements are? Is it done on a maximum value in the hour in that season slice? Or is it done on average basis, or is it done on a worst day basis? I mean, all of those things have an impact to a large degree on sort of how much cushion you're thinking you're building in, or what you're building in terms of the system to meet load. Allocation requirements, or perhaps how it gets allocated, is probably less of an impact on sort of exactly what the reliability is and what the impact of the reliability is. But the last thing, and so we will talk about that today, but the last thing I want to sort of highlight on this sort of final framework is sort of where the planning reserve margin comes in. Currently, we have a planning reserve margin. We think about a planning reserve margin. We think about, oh, we've got a distribution of all of these different things. We've got a distribution of load. We've got a distribution of resource output. We've got a distribution of resource availability. How are we accounting for the fact that we're setting a requirement, a deterministic value for our targets, to make sure that we're covering a range of possibilities that could occur? The way we've done this in the past is largely through a planning reserve margin. Planning reserve margin is made up of a number of different components, some of which are going to be necessary because they're necessary for operating the grid. So it's not just meeting load, it's also meeting the operational needs of capacity that is needed to essentially meet that load, which largely includes operating reserves and those sorts of things. But the planning reserve margin also is a way to capture some of the other uncertainty that we have in very much the structure and how the structure is setting up the requirements and the resource counting in terms of how the resource counting is working. And so we'll talk more about that today. So the important thing, sort of the one thing I want to make sure that people are realizing is that, yes, we've been talking about these things separately, but they are all going to come together and they are all dependent upon each other in setting up what the RA framework is going to look like. So Luke, let's go to the next slide. Factors for consideration. We have structure, we have resource counting, we have load forecasting, we have PRM. And what this table is doing is just giving some sort of an indication of of how each of these and how you decide on each one of these has an impact on the level of reliability and how much reliability there's going to be in the system. And so it does matter in terms of having sort of how much are you thinking about this, and how much are these things going to be interacting? So when we start choosing things and nailing things down, we understand that if we nail this particular aspect down in terms of one decision, say in a slice and season structure, that has implications for the most part for other aspects, including in terms of resource counting and load and PRM for the most part. Generally, the way we see the planning reserve margin is very much as something that is used to be able, that can be used essentially to be able to hit that level of reliability that is desired. The level of reliability as reflected in the loss of load expectation, and basically making sure that the planning reserve margin could be up or down essentially to be able to hit that value. I see a hand up. I don't know, Bridget, let's go ahead and take questions at this point.
Yeah, thanks. So one comment I have is, while the CAISA obviously continues to think that UCAP is sort of the best directions to capture the outage rates, if parties don't agree, if we don't move that way, I think it would be worthwhile revisiting what the actual outage rates are, rather than continuing the assumption that, 6 to 7.5% is still appropriate. And then, kind of differentiating it between like ambient derates versus plant trouble kind of outages. So my only comment is that I think even if we don't move towards UCAP, I think it'd be worthwhile to revisit what a more realistic forced outage rate assumption would be for the PRM, rather than just sort of assuming that, 15% is still good enough, considering that was selected back, 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. So
yeah, Bridget, thank you for that. And that you're highlighting for the sort of the interdependencies for the most part, in terms of if we are going to be assuming something about in any particular one of these pieces, we need to check it against what else we're assuming and what else we're counting on in some of the other pieces. So I tend to agree with you. If we decide not to go with a UCAP type of approach, we do need to sort of have a very explicit sort of, okay, what sort of implication does that have on the planning reserve margin, particularly if we have a component of the planning reserve margin looking for forced outages.
Okay, I see many people with their hands up. This is Sergio Duenas with CISA, by the way. So I think we can go next to Matthew Barmick. I think he was the next with his hand up.
Hey, Peter, this is Matt from Calpine. I think you might get into this later. I just wanted to be crystal clear that this slide is illustrative, and you're not suggesting that 15% is an appropriate planning reserve margin for the middle column of this table.
No, that's exactly right, Matt. I mean, and thank you for highlighting that. This is really very, very much illustrative, and 15%, as we're going to talk about, 15% comes out of an analysis from many years ago, and I think PG&E would argue, hey, any type of analysis needs to be updated, and how we're setting the PRM in this type of an RA structure needs to be reevaluated given the other aspects of how we're setting up the RA system.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that clarification.
Okay, just a reminder for folks that have already had their question answered to lower their hands. Next up, we have Mary Lynch.
Thanks. Can you hear me, Peter?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, it's Mary Lynch with Constellation. I think my question is similar to Matt's. Just on this chart, you're not saying that, for instance, a 24 slice monthly has to go with the 1 and 2 load forecast.
No, not
right?
at all.
Okay, so
no.
all these pieces are interchangeable, and okay,
they're all dependent upon each other, and
right.
and the way the chart is set up basically is it's going from things that may be a little less reliable to something that's a little more reliable. On that aspect alone, holding everything else constant.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, let's move on to Kathleen Colbert.
Great, thanks. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so not trying. Your answers have been kind of helpful. I am also focused, I think, on the PRM. I do think that there's a lot to there's a lot we need to discuss, but one of the things that I find challenging, and I was curious if I could get a better sense of what you're intending here, is that the PRM needs to be tuned to all the other decisions that we might make, the structure, the counting, yes, the load forecast, but I think I was imagining the scope of just this workshop and the next one to really focus on the load forecast. Are you also thinking it will include PRM decisions that would be are you also thinking it should include the PRM decisions? And if so, are we going to come back and true it up on December 15th? This is kind of a process question, but I appreciate you spending a little time talking about it.
Yeah, no, Kathleen, the intent for the most part is really just in this workshop is really just to lay out sort of what the pieces are and how the pieces need to be taking into account the other aspects of the RA program. And so we're not going to decide what a particular PRM is in this workshop. What we may talk about is what sort of elements should be going in explicitly into the PRM, to be determined later, depending upon sort of how we're handling some of the other features.
Okay, that sounds that's really helpful. We did make a suggestion for a new element to be included in one of our earlier presentations. If this isn't the right time, I can hold it. But I'm ready to get
yeah, we will be talking about PRM a little later. So if you could hold
Perfect.
it, that would be good.
Thank you.
But make sure you actually ask it and let us know.
Okay, next up we have Greg Morris.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. I'm unmuted now, I think. Yes, I just wanted to say that, and this is a good slide to look at, that in particular, the PRM and the load forecast are very much related. And I think that there's been a tendency in various commission proceedings to say that, for example, in response to the 2020 heat wave, that we should increase the PRM to take that into account on a reliability basis. But really what we need to be, I think, my opinion, focused on is the load forecast, because in fact, that was a 1 in 35 event, and not suggesting we go to 1 in 35, but if it's the PRM is really for very unpredictable variability, both in demand and variable resources. It's the load forecasts, though, that should take into account things like climate change, and we have to hope that the CEC is changing their estimates, whether even within the 1 in 2, the 1 in 5, the 1 in 10 framework, to account for climate change. And then we have to be cognizant of just which load forecast, whether it be 1 in 5, 1 in 10, we want to use, because that's a big driving factor. So that's my piece. Thank you.
Yeah, no, Greg, I agree that the load forecast is a big driving piece, and to some degree it's a question of it, and it fits in with all of these other pieces. And some of these pieces we may want to be able to move. We may want to allow the regulators to adjust more or less often. For example, the structure of the RA program. It's something that we probably don't want to. We probably would like to set it for a longer period of time. Similarly, for resource counting, we probably want to set it for a longer period of time. Why is that? Well, because transactions are being made for the most part based on sort of what those counting rules are and how the structure is set up. For something like the plan, the load forecast can vary from year to year, and you're right. It's the commission. We're hoping the CEC is taking into account the changes in some of that historic. That we're relying on this historic to, we're getting a new distribution to some degree of potential loads. And we need to be making sure that that's reflective in whatever load forecast we use, whether it be a 1 in 2 or a 1 in 5. Arguably, however, the Prm reserve margin is the one piece that basically will allow sort of a quantity go up and down that needs to be procured, go up and down relatively easily. And so that might be the right thing or the easiest thing for the commission to adjust on a regular basis. That essentially there be an LOLE type of analysis done every year, every couple of years, and there could be an adjustment to, say, the PRM to be able to get to, and either that could be either up or down. If we have essentially more reliability than we think we need, we can lower the PRM. If we have a higher level of reliability that we want, then we can raise the PRM. So the PRM, for the most part, is one variable that is relatively easily changeable and can be changed as a result of analysis that's done on that piece. So that's part of the way we're thinking about it. But Greg, you're right. It really is something that needs to be taken into account as an option for how the requirements are set.
Thank you, and I agree. It's easier to quickly set the PRM one way or another, but it's really, we have to keep in mind that it's the load forecast that really drives this, and the load forecast, if it's changing because of climate change and or because we want greater or lesser reliability. But yes, we should continue to keep that as the driving factor. And it's easy to change the PRM, but let's not make it easy the right way to do it. So, but thanks.
Okay, next up we'll have David and then Carrie Bentley, please.
So I just want to pick up on a couple of points, including the one that Greg just made, and push a little further. This is a fairly complex stochastic modeling task.
Can you pause for a minute for those of us taking notes? David, who do you represent?
Sorry, Megawatt Storage Farms.
Thank you.
So this is a fairly complex statistical modeling task. And in fact, interestingly, there's a conference right now at Stanford today on data-centric AI modeling, which is addressing the issue of making sure you're using the right data when you're doing any kind of complex modeling. As we saw in the Texas blackout, there was a complex interplay of extreme cold leading to increased demand and leading to failure of natural gas resources and other effects. And so you really have to look at the cross correlations between all the different inputs. And I think without having statistical experts involved in developing the data that you're modeling off of, you're very likely to end up in a situation where it's garbage in and garbage out. So the first point would be, you really need to involve people who are experts in statistical modeling in order to end up with results that are at all meaningful and relevant. The second thing is, has anybody looked at the amount of computing resources that would be required to just do this on a fine-grained basis for a year or multiple years, rather than trying to decide between doing 1 and 4 hour slices? Because clearly the cost of over provisioning is much greater than the cost of going out and buying, $1 million computer cluster and putting a couple of experts on simulating. That cost is tiny compared to the cost of over provisioning by, a few gigawatt hours of storage, for example.
Yeah,
So look at the computing cost issue.
Well, the computing cost issue, I mean, I tend to agree with you that this is a fairly complex stochastic problem that does need analysis. The question to some degree is sort of who's going to do that analysis, how is that analysis going to get paid for, and how is that going to get adopted and put into public policy? For the most part, and again, this gets at less at sort of what is the problem that needs to be solved, and more to who has the incentive essentially to step up and to do this, and to do it in a way that is even-handed and looks at trying to get the right answer. For the most part, all of the parties that are involved in these discussions have vested interest in sort of what the results are and how this program is going to be working. And so it's a difficult task for the most part to be able to say one entity should be able to be the one to step up and to do that analysis. We might think that the PUC would be the fairest and the best way to do that. it's not at all clear that the PUC has the ability to marshal essentially the resources to be able to do the type of analysis that's being suggested. So I sympathize with yes, to get to the right answer, it's really just a computational question and making decisions about where what level of uncertainty that you're willing to live with in terms of having that informed. But the real question to some degree is how are we going to get there, and who's going to be able to do that analysis in an unbiased way? And I think that is I don't know that there's an obvious answer to that.
Thanks.
Carrie Bentley, do you want to go ahead with your question?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Peter. This is Carrie Bentley with Gridwell Consulting. I was just wondering, under your notes and relationships, it says that your cushion from 4-hour needs to be tested as part of LOLE modeling. And maybe this is an add-on to the conversation we just had. Is PG&E's proposal to do LOLE modeling up front to determine the different slice reliability cushions? Or what's your actual proposal to get from all these factors to ensuring, a 1 in 10 LOLE?
Well, Carrie, I think there needs to be some LOLE analysis done, that once some of the decisions are made about some of these things, that would go into essentially determining what the right values would be and how the adjustments should be made.
But what's your proposal on what should be static going into the LOLE and what will be flexible? For example, you could pin down your slices and your resource counting and then allow LOLE to determine the PRM, or you could do it the reverse way, right?
Correct. You could do it either way. For the most part, the LOLE analysis, and again, this gets at coordination with the IRP and what the IRP is doing, and how the IRP is setting up. And we'll talk a little more about this. But you're right, Carrie, in that we could essentially determine sort of which of these factors we want to nail down, and then determine how the other factors need to be able to adjust to be able to get to the level of reliability that we need. That certainly is one path forward. Is that the right path forward? Well, we would need to get agreement for the most part on what some of those things are that we are willing to all live with, such as essentially the structure, whether it be a 24th slice monthly or it be a 4-hour slice with seasons. I mean, those things we need to be nailed down to some degree. We also need to be able to put in what we think the right counting is. And for the most part, what we're willing to live with in terms of the load forecast. Once all of those things can be put in together, essentially, we can then essentially determine what the right PRM is.
I see. And would you say that's PG&E's proposal, is to pin down the 4-hour slice? Like, is one of these your proposal, or are you just outlining all possibilities at this point?
At this point, Carrie, the point of the discussion is not to come up with a PG&E proposal that PG&E thinks is right, and it is really very much to come up with a proposal that stakeholders thinks is right, and what stakeholders think is the right way to approach this. And so, for the most part, we're laying out various options. We're laying out those options largely for people to understand what some of the trade-offs are, so that they can make a determination as to what they think the right structure should be, the right counting should be, the right load forecast should be, and then and have that be essentially go into a single determination.
Thank you. That makes sense.
Okay. Thanks, Carrie.
Okay, I see no other hands up, Peter, so we can keep going. Well, actually, if I may ask one question,
sure.
Using my privilege now as moderator in a way. It seems to me that this table is written in a way that from left to right in each of the rows, we're seeing sort of an increase in reliability / insurance, as you put it. And I was wondering, in the first row, when we talk about the structure, I can understand why there seems to be given the potential for over procurement with 4-hour slices, it could seem that could yield greater insurance. But I was wondering if you guys have given thought to the impacts of cutoff effects of the slices as well, particularly near the net peak period. If we have requirements that seem to last, let's think about noon to 4 p.m. or 1 to 5 p.m. And then those requirements change drastically for the next hour, for the next slice, that is. Do you think this is something that might affect reliability, particularly when we have more variance in the net peak? Or is that something more to be considered perhaps in the exceedance side rather than in the structure of slices? And really, this is more a question on your thinking and how the PG&E team has thought about the risks of slices in general.
Sergio, that's a good question. And part of the way we've been thinking about it is if you put more hours together and how you determine what that requirement is, will have an impact to some degree on how much excess you'll have. For instance, the current RA structure we have now, we're basing it's a monthly structure. We basically set the requirement in all hours of that month based on essentially the 1 hour of peak and with a planning reserve margin. And so arguably under the current structure, if you're thinking about how much am I going to need in each hour, I'm way over procuring because I'm procuring essentially to a level that is essentially 115 of what I think the highest demand is going to be in that month. And the point to some degree is, okay, from an over procurement standpoint, from a procurement standpoint, I may be over procuring, but from a reliability standpoint, I'm getting a whole lot of reliability. And I'm getting a whole lot of reliability because of the fact that I am buying so much and buying it to cover that requirement. And so the point to some degree is you just have to be mindful of sort of what the trade-off is about, am I buying too much in any particular period to be able to do that? And sort of how you define the periods and how you define the seasons really has an impact on sort of how much over procurement and how much sort of excess am I buying for many hours that may not be needed. And that's why to some degree in the first row, we've put over sort of to the right that you're building in to some degree more cushion if you aggregate more hours together and you aggregate more months into seasons. And the question is okay, is that going to lead to a lower planning reserve margin? Maybe it will, maybe it won't. It may or may not at that sort of aspect. But the thinking to some degree is we just need to keep in mind that it matters. It matters and how it matters and how it matters in that regard. So I think what you're pointing to is that having say just 2 slices per day and having it based on, depending upon what that differential is, you could be causing problems because of a transition aspect. And you could be adding to a reliability problem because of a transition aspect. I think that actually is certainly possible. It certainly is possible that you could be setting it up to have a potential problem, which is with the transition between slices within the day. And that's why I think it's also need to be very mindful of sort of, okay, how am I thinking about those slices and how they should be defined? So I don't know, Sergio, if that answers your question or not.
Yeah, that gives me a good idea and some food for thought as well. So thank you, Peter.
Okay. If there are no other questions at this point, let's push forward on the presentation. So factors for consideration, and pretty much I've been talking a little bit about this, but this summarizes it in terms of there is an interaction sort of between the factors that could be chosen independently. And so as we're making the decisions about what to nail down, we need to be thinking about, okay, what limitations are there for other aspects of how we're trying to get to reliability that would need to be mindful of when we determine one particular aspect. There's also sort of a balancing approaches. If we determine that it's more or less conservative to do one factor, that can have an impact on sort of what some of the other factors are. If we go to a higher load forecast, say to a 1 in 5 or a 1 in 10, off of our 1 in what we have now, which is a 1 in 2, that also will have an impact in terms of, because we're essentially having an impact on that. And that might have an impact on sort of how we count things as well. We need to sort of keep that in mind and how that might work. We want to also balance the distribution of costs and benefits across sort of a more reliable system is generally going to cost more than a less reliable system. And we need to make sure that we're understanding sort of how those balances and how that balances trades off in terms of what those costs are and how much they are. And finally, this is something I talked about in terms of PRM flexibility. Generally, we see the PRM as being the most flexible component of the whole RA framework that determines what the level of reliability is. Level of reliability is sort of how often you want to have outages on the system as a whole. And the PRM essentially is the one that is most easily adjusted and has less impact on sort of the other aspects of the system, including things like transactability and administrative burden. So those are the factors to sort of that we're putting forward to sort of say, okay, when we start nailing this stuff down, these are the things that we need to be thinking about and how it should work. Let's go to the next slide. Just to recap sort of where we are in some of the things that have been put forward. There have been generally a couple of different options that have been put forward. One is a 4-hour slice. One is a 24 slice type of program. Both of these could work, but it could work also for a net load or a gross load basis. Certainly on the top graph there on the right is the net load. On the bottom graph on the right is the gross load. There are implications for these. Both of these could work, and both of them could have different impacts to some degree on some of the other aspects of what we're determining. So next slide, please. Similarly, resource counting. To recap, for use limited resources, we're thinking about the various ways to do this. We're proposing an exceedance type. ELCC has also been used under the current framework. Use limited resources, the level in terms of what the exceedance is, that we've had some discussion about in terms of whether it's what level it's 50, 75, 25. Whatever it is, that will also have an impact on this. The dispatchable resources, UCAP is certainly one way to take into account things like forced outage rates. It's not the only way. And as I think as Bridget pointed out, it's something that we need to be very mindful of how we're taking in that uncertainty into account when we're setting up other aspects of the program. The implementation rules of the slice, sort of how are we setting the requirements in each slice? Are we taking a minimum value of what a resource can count within a slice? Are we taking a maximum? Are we taking an average? What are we doing it, particularly if we have multi-hour slices? If we have 24 slices per day, then that's a little more straightforward in terms of what that might be. But you still have to decide whether is it maximum, is it average, is it minimum? What is a resource going to be able to count for in those terms? And more generous counting rules will result in a less reliable system, and you might have to make that up with some other aspect, either in a higher planning reserve margin or an adjustment to the load forecast. Similarly, less generous counting rules when it comes to resource counting essentially will also have an impact and have an impact in adjusting what they should be. So with that, let me see if there are any questions.
I see Kathleen Colbert has her hand up.
Yes, Kathleen.
Great, thank you. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Peter, can you go back to slide 9, please?
Sure.
I just wanted to ask, I noticed that the two slice proposal that I believe covered at the last workshop, they're blurring for me, that Vistra sponsored for Gridwell isn't on your recap here. Can you talk a little bit about the two slice, please?
The two slices, I understand it, would basically, and I'm not sure how the slices have been defined in the two slice proposal, if they're equally sized slices or if they were going to be different slices. My understanding of it is and again, that's one of the reasons why it's I'm not sure what exactly that proposal is, to tell you the truth, Kathleen. Is that proposal a equal slice proposal, or is it equal hours proposal, or what exactly is that proposal?
That's a fair question. I could take a stab at it myself, but I think Carrie is on the line. Can I invite her to give her explanation?
Hi, this is Carrie Bentley for Gridwell Consulting. Yeah, so the two slice proposal, it has been rebranded from the seasonal to the two slice proposal by the CPUC energy staff. So let's go with that name, two slice proposal. It's a peak load requirement, just like today. And then there's a net load requirement, right? And so it's not two equal slices. If you saw my presentation, Peter, you could go to the requirement section of that. I mean, it articulates pretty clearly that the peak load would still be today, and then the net load would be calculated by the CAISO, just like they do in their FlexRA requirements. And then you would meet that with all non-solar RA. So two slices, pretty straightforward.
So, well, I'm two slices, so that varies by month, that varies by season. I guess you have 2 seasons, is that correct?
It could either be monthly or 2 seasons. We left that flexible.
You left that flexible, so you don't have a proposal in terms of the size of the seasons at this point. It's just,
it would be our preference would be for seasonal, but if you read the comments, multiple parties said that they would support it, but they preferred to keep it monthly. So I would say if you're doing a recap of parties who are supportive of it, I would say you would get more support for the monthly 2 slice. So if you're just doing a recap of party preference, even though we did propose seasonal, I would say it should be monthly.
Okay, I guess I guess the question to some degree is I'm not sure what the expectation is in terms of what the structures are in the recap, in terms of particularly since it was a proposal that was made, but it sounds like that proposal is changing at this point. And it wasn't at all clear from my perspective in terms of where that support was and who was sponsoring that proposal.
Well, I think if you just, both Vistra and Calpine sponsored it up front as for consideration. And then if you read the comments and you just do a Control F for Gridwell, you'd be able to incorporate it pretty easily.
So,
one other thing I throw out, Peter, just for some context, is that Vistra's, when we were doing, I think, the framework presentation, we provided a proposed framework for the requirements, including the PRM. I think the 2 slice proposal fits in pretty neatly as a foundation of a framework that what we had originally proposed can build off of. So if it helps provide more teeth and context, we can commit to doing a joint presentation at the next workshop to provide clarity.
Okay, that would be helpful because in terms of how the workshops were set up and what the topics were, it would be helpful to understand exactly what the proposal is and what the parameters are of the proposal.
No, I understand.
And how that fits into the slice of day concepts that the commission is looking for.
Yeah, no, I do understand that, and I think I had kind of just some process questions for today because we had presented that framework earlier, but it fits into these workshops, and wanted to get feedback from you if you wanted us to repeat it, or if that would be a waste of time. But I think I'm hearing that with the lens of how it sleeves with this structure would be helpful, and you think it would be worth it to repeat it.
Yeah, I'm going to say from PG&E's perspective, certainly we're wanting to hear what the suggestions are and how the proposals could be put together to be able to forward what the commission has asked for. You know, this is a working group process, and the working group process is to look at ideas and proposals. And look at how they could be put together to meet the objectives of the PUC.
No, that sounds great. I'll just do a little, if you don't mind, kind of clarification for everyone who's on the call. So Vistra's presentation from October 6th, and then Gridwell's presentation from November 3rd, I think are good ones to look at. As just to remind everyone, Vistra did present a PRM proposal back in.
And the resource no, I understand, Kathleen, and thank you for that.
Sure.
And so the resource counting to some degree is as was proposed by Gridwell.
I think, you know, and we can refine this between now and the next workshop. So let us take it back and look at it, because I do want to look at the comments in more detail with Gridwell and with Calpines, who also kind of jumped in and sponsored. So we need to do deeper conversations, but I just wanted to flag here and see if you had thought about it and why it was missing. I now think I understand the context for why, and we will be responsive to that.
Okay. No, I'm okay.
Yeah, this is Luke. I will admit, so I was the one who put this slide together, and the thing that wasn't clear to me is if you were to take that proposal and put it into graphical format, what would it look like? And I think what I'm hearing is that you would have kind of two tests. One would be at the gross peak, so this is maybe hour ending 18 or 19, and then another test at the net peak, which might be hour ending 19 or 20 for these particular 2026 loads. And so essentially you would have to stack up the resources in those 2 hours only. Do I have that right?
This is Carrie. That's correct.
Okay.
And then to be more specific, there's still a 24-hour move. So you would want to stack up those resources and just like here, show when they would be available over all hours.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
So Carrie, just to clarify on that, so all the resources would have to be available in all hours.
Yes, I think that's consistent across all proposals.
Okay.
24-hour move.
Okay, let's move over to Nick Pappas.
Hey, thanks, Sergio. Let me just get my train of thinking back onto these slices here. I must admit I kind of lost focus on my original question here. But Peter and Luke, I want to say thanks again for bringing us so much content and thinking around the trade-offs here. I think this is super helpful. One of the considerations that I think came through very strongly in the informal comments and also was very present in the discussions over the last year about the urgency of reform was the durability of resource counting. And I wanted to ask if you had thoughts on sort of the year-to-year durability and which of these frameworks may be more likely to necessitate, substantial year-to-year swings in resource counting versus adjustments that could be made with the PRM versus, how we would think about helping LSEs and developers or LSEs and generators think about how to sell a product, hopefully on a multi-year period, without having to think about the potential for a slice being adjusted hour to hour if it's a multi-hour slice or other considerations that could come here. So do you have any thoughts on whether the slice structure or other counting characteristics might support that durability goal?
Well, if I understand your question, Nick, I mean, some of the thoughts I've had to some degree on this topic is that the resource counting, for the most part, we want to be reflective. Want it to be reflective, essentially, what the resource can provide in the time that it's being relied upon to provide energy. And so that could vary from resource to resource in various ways, and so if the resource counting is basically based on an exceedance type of methodology, the question would be then, okay, how much of that going to change based on what the performance is if we're going to update it? How often are we going to update that exceedance in terms of that counting? And if it's a relatively consistent resource, then and it's producing in a way that it essentially can meet load or is producing to meet load, essentially, it could be relatively reflective. Now, granted, the value of the quantity that it could account for in any particular slice may vary depending upon what its history, what the exceedance history is. If we're updating, again, it's a question of how often do we update that exceedance. The thought to some degree is that we don't want to, we would rather not change very often. We don't really want to change also the structure very often either, because the structure will have a much bigger impact on the counting of that resource than sort of what does it produce in a particular slice and in the way the slice is determined. Particularly if we're looking at, say, a 24 slice system or 25 slice proposal, essentially what happens for the most part is that the performance over time essentially is caught by the exceedance type of methodology, and it's not going to vary a whole lot, or it shouldn't vary a whole lot. UCAP, on the other hand, will be able to catch some of that if we're going to a UCAP type of thing where the forced outage rates are taken into account and used to move forward. The idea for the most part is that we don't really want to be changing things that often. And if we are going to change things to meet new reliability needs or things that are unforeseen, it's better to try and change the planning reserve margin, which essentially can adjust to sort of a total quantity that's being procured. So is that helpful? Is that helpful?
Yeah, that's helpful. Maybe I can be more explicit in the situation I'm thinking of here. I think with solar and wind, there's less likelihood that we hit sort of massive swings year to year with exceedance. But I'm thinking of, like, as we increase our storage penetration over the next, let's say, 10 years, we're going to go from currently, like a 1 to 2 hour peak to effectively, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 hour peak as we get more and more penetration. And my thinking is, if we limit ourselves to a 4-hour structure, how will we adjust year over year, effectively the benefit of those storage resources of varying widths, et cetera? How do we sort of account for that flattening peak if we're stuck with this 4-hour structure? And I know historically, or there's been discussion in this framing about, kind of using the ELCC approach to reflect that. But I think from my view, it seems to become a very challenging process if you stick with your multi-hour slices.
Yeah, and Nick, I mean, the one way that I would want to say is for resources that do have the flexibility of being able to count for more than one slice, that it wouldn't necessarily, for instance, if I've got a 4-hour battery that basically is designed to essentially to operate at full output for 4 hours, essentially I can use that. That's a certain chunk of energy that I can use, that I can sort of call as capacity in various slices or various pieces to be able to meet a longer requirement. Say if it's a 4-hour, it doesn't have to be at its full maximum output to count for that particular slice. It could be, I could use it, I could basically cut it in half and say, okay, half of it is going to be used in this slice, half of it's going to be used in another slice. And that's on the counting side. On the charging side, I think we've already indicated that it doesn't have to basically come in a chunk of charge at the same sort of level. It just has to be able to, in the other slices, it needs to be able to get that to that total energy that's needed to be able to count for what it's counting for on the output side. Now, I understand that there's probably less flexibility with that than if you go to sort of an hour, 24 slice type of framework, where the 24 slice framework, you still have sort of that block of energy that you can allocate to hours. It's much easier to allocate to hours if you've got that, if you're thinking about how to allocate that. So for storage, I think we're trying to build in some flexibility on that. With other types of resources, it's a little different. And it really depends upon what can they do in that particular slice.
Got it. That's helpful. Thank you, Peter.
I see Julia Prochnik has her hand up.
Thanks, Sergio. Hi, everybody. Julia Prochnik with the Long Duration Energy Storage Association. Building on, and thanks, Peter, for the presentation. Really appreciate it, and Luke for helping with it. Building on Nick's point, I have two questions. So would an 8-hour battery then be able to be both in the 4-hour back-to-back, or just really want to be in the 24-hour from your perspective?
An 8-hour battery, essentially, if it basically has full output for 8 hours, you're basically saying I can the maximum I can count any particular hour is sort of what its maximum output can be in that hour. And so there's some flexibility in terms of if I've got an 8-hour battery that I can completely discharge in 4 hours or even in 1 hour, I can essentially count that for the capacity in that particular slice or hour. Does that answer your question, or do I need to push it a little further?
Push a little further. It
Okay.
does, but I feel like you're not getting the efficiency or the cost effectiveness with making an 8-hour go 1 hour. You want the 8-hour to be 8-hour or go up to more, like
or to go up to more, and it could go up to more. It could go up to 16 hours, or it could go up to whatever. It's limited essentially by sort of what the maximum output is, sort of the energy is, that as well as limited by sort of what it can put out at any particular time in any particular slice.
Okay.
So is that helpful?
It is. I want to noodle on that more too, and dig into the different slices.
Okay.
But thank you. The other question I have is, you mentioned earlier about the interdependencies and transitions, and I think that I was curious about. It almost seemed like you want to increase the number of transitions, and I think we want to decrease the number of transitions to decrease risk.
In terms of transitions between slices, or?
Yeah.
The proposals that are sort of, I mean, there's a couple of ways to looking at it. Is it how are you thinking about sort of what these these transitions are, and how quickly can resources react to the transitions? And sort of, if we go with a slice that's longer than a single hour, if we go to a multi-hour slice, then essentially you're requiring essentially the resource to be able to be available for a longer period of time. And that may have an impact, could have an impact essentially of how easily they can move to another slice or do that transition. If you think about things as doing it on shorter slices, it's like, what can I provide in that hour? Then essentially the transitions for the most part are perhaps less of a concern, because it's sort of you're moving out the capability that the resource can have over a longer period of time with more flexibility.
Okay. Thanks for a deeper perspective on that. Appreciate it.
Okay. I see Dariush and Eric Little have their hands up. So if you guys want to go next, then I'll ask question and we keep going.
Hello, Peter. I'm assuming you can hear me, right?
Yes, I can hear you, Dariush.
Perfect. So I have a question regarding these slices. As you know, we're very supportive of a slice-of-day proposal. Is there any reason why the length of these slices should be the same? Why is there any reason why we have a short time slice for the critical time of the slice of day for a particular season, so that we have that slice fully covered? Some people even talk about just focus on 8 p.m. or something. And then for the other slices, the length of the slice could be a lot longer, because it really doesn't matter from RA perspective. It doesn't matter as much from RA perspective. It matters that we have enough energy for charging during those slices and so on, and that spreads over many hours. But as far as capacity is concerned, it's probably not as critical during those slices. Anyway, I'm going from. Is there any reason why these slices must be either 1 hour each, or 4 hour each, or 6 hours each?
Darius, the answer to that is no. There's no particular reason other than perhaps the ease of administration and the ease of essentially setting up the program to be able to make sure you've got the coverage that you need. One aspect, though, of this is what happens when things start moving around. If you're thinking about having slices that are of different durations, what happens when how your requirements essentially are moving, or your load is moving between those slices, and how do you think about, oh, I need to adjust the slice. For instance, if you were to go to something, like a peak slice at a net load peak slice, what happens when that net load starts moving around, and how do you make sure that whatever you're defining those slices are, that those slices essentially are covering all of the hours that are needed? You point out the fact that you think that the capacity is less necessary in some of the hours of the day, and that may well be the case. The question to some degree is, over time, how do you assure the fact that when load moves, that your slice definitions are still relevant?
Yeah, I can see that point, and obviously it's one factor that should be considered. And for 4 hour slice, the same thing could happen, where you can go from one 4 hour slice to another.
That's correct.
But point well taken. It's probably something against defining the critical slice. It's the so-called critical slice. Currently, that critical slice is 1 hour in a whole month. But that critical slice is somewhat wide enough so that we stay, from commercial standpoint, we stay within that slice as the one for which RA capacity is most valuable. Okay.
So, and Darius, there's a reason why we've got sort of a 4 hour basis now for the RA structure, and that even when it's based on peak demand, we don't know which hour that peak demand is going to take place, but we have a pretty good idea of the 4 hour period when that peak demand is going to take place. And that's sort of one of the reasons why it's like, okay, it's based on a 4 hour thinking. At least the 4 hour thinking underlying today's RA structure is that we don't know exactly which hour it's going to take place, the peak is going to take place, but we know it's going to be in one of these 4 hours.
Okay. I see that you're picking your 4 hours and very much close to the 3 hours we would like to push, but I think we can go for 4 hours. But at least, but the others do not have to be that wide, that narrow. I mean, chances.
No, you're right in that the others don't have to be that narrow. The question to some degree is, how do I deal with sort of, okay, I've got a 4 hour slice, and then I've got a 20 hour slice. Okay, what happens when my peak essentially moves out of the 4 hours into the 20 hour slice? Do I redefine the slices, or or does my requirements jump up in that 20 hour slice? If I am I setting myself up for having to redefine the slices if I go to essentially something that doesn't cover everything and doesn't cover everything in a relatively equal way? It doesn't have to, and you're absolutely right. It doesn't have to be that way, but it does try to address the changes over time and how changes over time might work.
Okay, point well taken. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Hey, Peter, Eric Little from CalCCA. So question for you, and I want to note, I think this is an issue for any of the slice types of proposals, but energy storage to me gets a bit bizarre when it comes to charge and discharge and how you appropriately account for that in the accounting mechanism. So let me just give you a simple example. Your top right chart has 6 different slices. And so let's start with the first large slice in the day. It looks like hour ending 2 is when that starts. So suppose that I say it's going to charge, then discharge in the next one, charge in the next one, discharge in the following one, charge in the following one, and discharge after that. That would say that it's going to charge during the net load peak, which is extremely unlikely to have happen. But suppose that someone for their portfolio for RA needed to show the resource that way to meet their accounting requirements. The difficulty that I have is that the RA program has always been predicated on this idea of if only the RA fleet showed up, would you be able to satisfy the grid needs? And now the problem that you have is if only the RA fleet shows up in any particular slice, what happens? And the problem with energy storage is that's dependent upon what happened in the prior slice as well. So if only the RA fleet showed up in every single one of these slices, then I could see that the energy storage device may indeed charge in that interval of the net load peak because the price in the period after that may even be higher because only the RA resources are there. But on a normal day, or even a slightly normal day, that type of charging and discharging structure is unlikely to actually happen, and the bids submitted in the market to charge that resource during the net load peak are very unlikely to be struck, and then the resource isn't actually available to meet its discharge in the following hour. So I'm just curious as to how we deal with that type of an issue as we move forward. And I'm sorry, I just saw from Noah, it looks like your question is in the 24 individual slices, does that problem get taken care of? And no, I think the answer is no, because I can do the same thing, right? I can group together 4 1-hour slices and do the same exact thing as is in the example that I have here. So I'm struggling with how do I ensure that in the periods when I'm expecting to discharge it, that it was actually charged in those prior periods to be able to get to the discharge if I'm going to use that in more than one interval per day. So I think it's something that we need to think about, but I'm wondering if you guys have contemplated this and figured out how to deal with that issue.
I guess my immediate reaction to something like that, Eric, is to what degree are you pointing to an operational problem and saying that the operational problem needs to be taken into account in terms of the capacity aspect, in terms of providing that resource to the ISO to optimize?
Yeah, so to some extent it's that, Peter, but I think to some extent it's a different nature of the asset, right? The RA program was developed at a point in time where you primarily had gas-fired resources, and to be able to operate it just meant that you started it up. You didn't have to wind the crank before you got there. You simply started it up. In the case of energy storage, you've got to have a period where you wind the crank. And now the question is, winding that crank is dependent upon what the prices in the energy market are and whether or not you actually cleared a bid. So I don't know if that actually works in these set of circumstances, because I can bid the charge cycle at a price low enough that it's not going to expect charge, even though it's an RA resource for a discharge in the next interval, and then it's not actually there. So yes, some of it is dispatch on the system, but some of it is just the nature of the fact that the resource can't discharge at will because it has to have that charge cycle that comes before it.
And to some degree, the way we're trying to take that into account in the structure, Eric, is by requiring that the charging aspect of it be specified in terms of where the requirement is.
Be specified in terms of which interval that it is, but I guess then how do you deal with the fact that there's uncertainty in its operation and a great deal of uncertainty in its operation in terms of charge?
In terms of what the charge is, I mean, I think to some degree you're getting at, what is the right way to measure the output and what the resource can count for. If the resource basically, I mean, to some degree, you're asking, how do I absolutely make sure that the resource is charged to be able to discharge when I'm going to rely on it to meet load to discharge? And I guess the question is that's not just a capacity question, an RA question. That is also an energy market question. And for the most part, I mean, are you saying that the commission needs to set its RA program up to make sure that the ISO will dispatch essentially that storage when it says it's needed?
Yeah, so let me be clear here, because I do see some messages in the chat. I am not confusing a showing versus operational concerns in any manner, so let me try to re-describe this. The RA program and its accounting mechanism should give us reasonable assurance that the grid will operate reliably if only the RA fleet is there in that interval. My concern is that we may not have that with energy storage, depending upon whether or not it actually charged in a previous interval. So I know you've talked about ELCCs and those sorts of things. Is that the solution to that problem? Because the energy storage devices, the accounting mechanism seems great, as long as I assume that in operation it's actually going to do what it did in the accounting mechanism. But I think it's kind of a far-fetched idea to believe that during the net peak load hour, that resource is going to be charging so that it's available in the following interval.
If Eric, if that's the way the LSE wants to show it, in terms of having it be charging during a net load peak hour when prices are likely to be high, then they're going to have to bring capacity in that period essentially to charge. So it's the LSE for the most part is increasing. Storage is not a panacea when it comes essentially to capacity aspects, because it's a net loser. The way we're setting it up is that if the storage wants to count in any particular slice, it has to be able to bring the capacity in other slices to show that it can charge, plus whatever the round trip losses are. So I hear what you're saying, which is you're trying to point to something and say this won't work because maybe I'm not understanding it correctly, but I think what you're saying is that this won't work because we're not assuring that the resource will actually be there when we think it'll be there, when it needs to be there.
Yeah, so I'm not saying that it won't work. What I'm saying is it seems like there's an additional uncertainty here surrounding this. So, and I think it may come down to Carrie's question about there being 8-hour startup time resources and how is that different from storage? The answer is I can start that up in 8 hours and know that it's going to run. With a battery, if it has not been charged, it is not going to discharge, period. So that's the difference between the two. For the gas-fired resource, it simply, it has to go through its startup process, and that may take some time. But that's with the battery, it's a different story. If there's no energy sitting in the battery, there is no starting it up. So again, all that I'm trying to point out here is that it's not an issue of this won't work. It's an issue of how do we make reasonable assurances that the accounting mechanism that we're using here has reasonable odds of actually playing out in the market that way to where it is going to provide the reliability that we think it's going to provide. We already know that we have uncertainties associated with other resources, and we deal with those uncertainties about those resources in certain ways. So I'll let it go there. Thanks.
Okay. Well, thanks, Eric.
Okay, I see we have a very lively conversation in the chat and people raising hands. As I mentioned before, I wanted to ask a question, and then we'll keep going. So this is Sergio Dueñez with CISA. First, I wanted to react quickly to what Eric said. I agree with the fact that we do expect an RA program to give us an idea of how the fleet would operate in the sample day or the example day that we're using to plan for. I disagree with the idea that RA should contemplate every single factor of the day of operations and included, since RA is a representation of sufficiency. I do think that for storage, there are significant operational assurances that guarantee that storage will charge in periods where energy costs are lower and discharge in periods where are higher. You can refer to the study, for example, of Lumen Energy Strategy for compliance of AB 2514, where we can see that storage is consistently charging in the periods of renewable surplus and discharging before and during the peak and net peak periods and later on. We have economic incentives to do so. In that sense, the RA program should incorporate some, but not absolutely all, the particularities of operations, because it doesn't do so for all resources either. It captures the key elements, and I think here the sufficiency of energy is important. But what I wanted to bring up in my question originally was, Peter, you mentioned that for PG&E, from their point of view, a storage resource should count for the maximum power it can supply over a period of time, given their point of interconnection limitations, right? So if you have a 4-hour resource of 100 megawatts, you can count for 100 megawatts in 4 hours, or 50 megawatts in 8 hours. Or if your point of interconnection is 200 megawatts, you can count for 200 megawatts in 2 hours. That is great for optionality, but I think there is a potential difficulty in showing the alternate case of an 8-hour resource being shown for longer. And that is because we're limiting the showing of charging sufficiency to the day that we're looking at, right? If we were to look at prior months, for example, we could use excess charge energy of, let's say, March to charge a longer duration resource that might be to be shown in August. Under the current framework of your storage needs to ensure daily charging sufficiency, longer duration resources might be overlooked and couldn't be included into this framework. So that's something that I wanted to point out. For example, if we have an 8-hour resource that could be shown for 12 hours, it won't take exactly 12 hours to charge, right? It might take a little bit more. So we might be thinking of, why don't we have seasonal, if the seasons are monthly then, but monthly carryover of charging for resources that are very long duration, for example. I think that is a good representation of some of the need for charging. It still might be overly conservative because the need for charging is not only it's not only LSE specific, right? It's system wide. So it's something that can be incorporated there. Next, I see, well, I'll give a moment if you want to respond to that, Peter, but next I see Kathleen again, David, and then we can move on.
No, Sergio, you bring up a point which I think we haven't discussed, which I think needs probably some discussion. I'm not prepared to discuss it now and here, but what you're pointing to is that what about longer duration storage? And the fact that we're looking at a representative day and we're representing a day for a month. And what happens essentially, is that the right way to be thinking about having a representative day be the measure for the entire month? And is there a way essentially, because for resources that have carryovers between months or between periods, RA periods, how are we looking at that and how are we thinking about that? So I hear the question, Sergio, and I agree. More consideration needs to be given.
Yeah, and as we're getting in this subjects of structure, and I see you later, you'll have some slides also recapping resource counting. Let's bear in mind the focus of today's conversation, please. That is on need allocation. We have a lot of other material prepared by PG&E. We understand that this is a recap of everything we've discussed and everything is interconnected, but to the degree possible, let's try to move the conversation so that we can get to the matter at hand. So next up we have Kathleen and then David again, and then we can keep going.
Great, thank you, Sergio and Peter. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I gotta say, I just echo everything Sergio said. So you took a lot of, so I'll be short and sweet. I think that this is an important conversation, as everyone on this call knows, because we talk about it every meeting, and I chime in every meeting on the topic of storage as a major storage developer and operator. I do think the question it factors into need, but it's a different need question than what our load needs are, and how we should be thinking about the risks and uncertainties associated with that, setting in the PRM. Not that it shouldn't be something we discuss. I just want to make sure we don't lose sight of that first question, and then maybe let's have this as another follow-up. I will also tease that at the next workshop, when Gridwell and Vistra give our joint presentation, we'll provide a proposal for addressing this concern as well under that framework. I think we'll address some of these questions and concerns, but yes, let's not lose sight. Echo Sergio. I'm really curious to hear about the load forecast.
Next up, David, do you have anything to add to?
Yes, it's David Mcmillan at Megawatt Storage. I just want to pick up on Eric's comment because I think it's important. We're effectively going through a transition where historically we had a giant just-in-time delivery grid, and we had a bunch of resources, as Eric mentioned, that we could turn on at any time in order to provide that. And yes, there's lead time and starting some up, but we're pretty good at forecasting. You can see that by looking at CAISO's daily forecasts. They can pretty well nail what they need. And so using that, we could do planning that was relatively smooth, and we could take an RA framework that said, hey, we know what our worst case day is going to be, and we're going to tack 15% on it or whatever, and we're well protected. Well, we're changing to a completely different grid because we now have intermittent generators through solar and wind. We're going to have to go to high storage in order to bank that energy and use it at night. So we're no longer a just-in-time delivery system. We're a store and forward system. And as Eric was hinting at, and I'm going to explicitly put it on the table, because you have to charge the storage before you can use it, the solution of how to manage the grid is path dependent, in that if you didn't store 8 hours of storage, you don't have that available as a resource. And so you've got two distinct things that you have to plan for. And this is a far more complex planning environment than where you've got dispatchable resources that you can start at any time and put on the grid. So I think we have to be careful in picking between solutions that we're clear that we're asking the right question. And I'm concerned that some of the approaches that I'm seeing aren't taking into account that we're fundamentally changing the architecture of the grid and are trying to take historic approaches for a just-in-time delivery with schedulable and dispatchable generators to a model where we've got all these intermittencies on the grid, but we've got the ability now to store and forward as long as we do the charging in advance. One other point is I think the shoulders on the grid make a big difference on how much over provisioning. And I'll put in chat a link to a diagram I did that just took a representative day based on discussion that Sergio and I had about a week ago. And I've just drawn on boxes here to try to estimate the over provisioning that would occur for November the 10th if you took 4-hour slices. And I'm getting over provisioning of about 60 gigawatt hours. So that just suggests that we, again, it goes back to the idea that you'd be willing to put an awful lot of computing resources and modeling talent in to avoid over provisioning by 60 gigawatt hours.
David, let me respond. I agree with you that the grid is changing and that we need to basically be nimble enough to make sure that whatever changes we're making now are going to be reflective of the grid that we think will be moving forward. And you're correct that essentially the real-time delivery aspect of the grid is changing to one where there is more storage, and more storage is going to be needed to be relied upon. I think, as you're going to hear, I think in some of the discussions where we have about the planning reserve margin, is that there's a question as to what degree does the planning reserve margin need to take into account some of the uncertainties that are caused by the fact that we're relying more on intermittent resources and storage types of resources. So I think that is, I think that it's something that needs to be taken into account. The question, to some degree in my mind, is exactly how do we take it into account, and what is the adjustment we're going to be making.
Okay, so that's the last question we had of people raising their hands. We have 20 minutes before noon, so Peter, I would suggest that we try to focus on the presentation, and then we'll have a quick break and we can come back for more questions.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to be able to finish the presentation in 20 minutes, particularly if we continue, but there is a breaking point coming up here. So let me get to that breaking point and see if that's the good time for the system for the group to break.
Okay.
All right, thanks, Sergio. Luke, let's go to the next slide. Let's see, we were we were at resource counting. We're now sort of at the factors. Factors, for the most part, are sort of what the RA structure is. Also sort of resource counting, we've talked about that. Load forecasting, we will be talking more about that later in this presentation. But the aspect also is the planning reserve margin and how the planning reserve margin fits in, and what are we including in the planning reserve margin? How much are we including for various aspects of uncertainties? Uncertainties that we know could appear on the system. And this could include essentially some of the uncertainties associated with storage and availability of storage and availability to some degree of resources and of charging. That is something that may well be factoring into some of the thinking, or could factor into some of the thinking. I won't say that it will or that it won't, but it is something that the system to some degree, I think under the current structure, can accommodate by thinking about how it wants to handle that in the planning reserve margin. Also, IRP coordination. Certainly, the RA program is set up as being a relatively short-term, or actually middle-term, sort of, depending upon what your time span is, way of making sure that resources that exist essentially are able to be available and will be available essentially to meet the load as we come into sort of an operating time frame. In terms of certainly done on a monthly basis currently. I anticipate the ISO will continue to do it on a monthly basis, regardless of sort of how it's decided that the PUC sets up the RA program. But there also does need to be coordination with the longer term. The longer term being looking down the road and seeing sort of what resources are being planned for, how we're planning for those for the loads to be met and the resources to be used in those timeframes. And so there does need to be coordination between the IRP and the RA structure. That coordination doesn't necessarily mean that one dictates the way something is set or something is done. Largely because I would argue that the problems that each is setting or trying to address are a bit different. Certainly in the longer term planning, the question is how do we think we're going to have, what resources do we need, what resources do we need to add, what resources are we okay with going away over time to be able to meet the longer term needs. In the RA framework, it's much more how are we going to assure that the resources that we have or that we have the right characteristics to some degree to be able to meet the needs that we are anticipating sort of on a daily basis. So there does need to be IRP coordination. Let's go to the next slide. In terms of the IRP coordination, the effectiveness of any sort of RA structure depends upon how well it is coordinated and how well it complements essentially the IRP process. Generally, when we talk about reliability, what we mean is the loss of load of expectation and sort of how that LOLE is set and what target that is set at. From that determines for the most part sort of not only in the RA structure, sort of what the, how many resources we may need or how we may want to set it up, but also in the IRP, it's basically setting up what resources do we think need to be online, given the resources that we have, to be able to meet the requirements of the future system. And that's not only a reliability requirements, that's also climate requirements and aspects of the system that we'd like to see. So from the perspective of where, what resources are going to be in existence, it's really the IRP that's determining what that is, both in what resources get added as well as what resources are allowed to essentially retire. So the target lock LOLE for the most part and the portfolio of resources from PG&E's perspective is those are the things that need to be determined in the IRP process and the IRP essentially proceeding. The LOLE type of analysis is going to really very much depend upon a lot of assumptions and whether the reflections, what the reflections are of those assumptions and how they are incorporated into the LOLE analysis. And so it's PG&E's position for the most part that the longer term expectation in terms of loss of load needs to be also reflected in the shorter term in terms of the RA structure, in terms of what that target LOLE is, whether it be 1 year in 10, whether it be 1 in 50, whether it be whatever it is. The program for the most part needs to be able to be reflective and be consistent in that way. There also needs to be consistency in terms of what the inputs are, what the assumptions are, what the distributions of future load are going to be. Essentially, we're moving into a period where there is likely to be some more climate change and accelerated climate change. We need to make sure that whatever we're forecasting the distribution of future loads to be reflective of what we think the changes are going to be on a climatological basis. And so that needs to be to some degree consistent between the IRP program and the RA program. Also, sort of the performance and what resources are going to be available, what their availability is. We don't necessarily want the IRP to be assuming forced outage rates that are different from the forced outage rates that would be assuming in the RA. We would want to have some consistency between those two, between the programs in terms of at least be reflective, if not exactly the same, but be reflective of what that aspect might be. And while all of this needs to fit together in a way that makes sense, and it makes sense for both the longer term planning and for the relatively shorter term planning. If they're not aligned, if those two processes are not aligned, if those two proceedings are not aligned in terms of what they're trying to accomplish and how they're interacting with each other, then we could easily get situations where the IRP is not meeting the consistent values or consistently what or the RA program is not meeting what consistently was assumed or how that was set up by in the IRP. And that's why we need to be extremely careful about sort of what the assumptions are, input assumptions are in terms of there being consistency and how that is set up. We could get too much reliability and that could cost too much, or alternatively, we could get too little reliability and have outages, and that could cost perhaps even more on the system if we start having outages on a more frequent basis than we like. So the two proceedings do need to be coordinated. Exactly how they're coordinated is a good question. There is efforts going on in both at this point, and we need to make sure that number one, that the commission, I think, sets a target level of reliability that should be set for both the IRP longer term view as well as the shorter term RA view. So let me stop there. I see there are questions or at least hands raised.
Okay, let's go with David, then Christian Lambert, and then Doug Carpa. Just as a reminder, please tell us who you're representing when you begin.
Sorry, my hand wasn't lowered from before. That was David.
Christian Lambert from Cal Advocates.
Hi, this is Christian Lambert with Cal Advocates, and confirming I am calling in today and showing up at the 607 area code phone number. If you can pull up the IRP slide, that's what I'd like to comment on today. I think from these bullet points regarding coordination with the IRP, it sort of projects a desire to see the IRP originate some of the combined work, particularly with respect to the IRP conducting an LLE study and solving for a desired LLE level. Respectfully, I'd like to offer perhaps a different perspective, and it's that while I acknowledge the choices in RA reform would create more or less endogeneity between RA and IRP, if one is more likely to drive the other, it's probably RA. And that's because the IRP has statutory obligations regarding the development of the reference system portfolio and the preferred system portfolio. That PSP comes from the aggregation of the individual LSE's IRPs. And if those IRPs have integrity, they are also revealing the RA fleet to the IRP. So LSEs, in building their IRPs to whatever comes out of RA reform, will be transmitting those portfolios to the IRP. The IRP will aggregate them, develop a PSP, and then run its LLE studies as a result. I think this is an issue for where are we getting the LLE, who is doing this work, and in which proceeding, in large part because of prior conversations and prior workshops. And I won't belabor those, but to summarize, it's the points about benefits emerging at the cumulative collective portfolio level that may not be apparent, and there may be no simple or even feasible way to allocate those benefits in advance at the level we need to get to NQCs for slice of day. It's things like, I think Tom Beach had mentioned, depending on the exceedance level that we choose, we can end up with the portfolio level exceedance that is much higher than if you were simply adding together or looking at just the resource level NQCs that result from those exceedance choices. It's the geographic diversity that Nick talked about with the wind fleet. For our own part, we would pitch also that geographic diversity in the solar fleet could be a very important hedge in the long term, for example, against cloud cover events with atmospheric rivers. These sorts of portfolio level benefits would be captured by an IRP-driven LLE study, but may or may not be evident when we get to those NQC choices that come out of RA reform that will be feeding into how LSEs assemble their own individual IRPs. So we see the directionality as the RA program and whatever comes out of RA reform will be driving the IRP, because that's what's going to drive the individual IRPs, which drive the PSP. And when those resources get built, they then drive the reference system portfolio as well. So to the extent that there's a desire by parties to see the IRP instead say, we want a 0.1 or whatever target level of LLE, and we're going to do the study and figure out what the resources are to get there on top of what's in the individual LSE IRPs, I think there's actually a high risk that if RA reform does not explicitly represent and allocate those portfolio benefits, that instead we're going to see the IRP aggregating individual LSE IRPs, running its LLE study, and finding on a regular basis that we have exceeded that 0.1 standard. If we want to have the IRP doing more, being in more of the driver's seat, then RA reform, I think, needs to be very careful about how to consider and allocate those portfolio level benefits. Thank you.
You're muted, Peter.
Yeah, let me respond. When we say that with a target level of LOLE, what we're meaning is the commission needs to decide what the appropriate level of reliability is. That generally is reflected through the LOLE. And for the most part, is that going to be a 1 in 10? Is it a 1 in 20? Is it a 1 in 50? Is it a 1 in 100? That's what we mean when we say that that there needs to be when the commission needs to determine what the LOLE is. It's not looking at sort of what everybody's going to bring their resources and we're going to check to see what sort of LOLE we come up with. It's no, the commission needs to decide what the target LOLE is in terms of how much reliability do we want. Do we want a 1 in 10? Do we want a 1 in 20? Do we want a 1 in 50? I don't know that the commission necessarily has given guidance as to how they would want, how the level of reliability is, other than to make adjustments to things like the planning reserve margin without doing analysis to sort of say, oh, well, we think we need more. How much more? And so what we're saying for the most part is the commission needs to provide a very strong signal as to what is the level of desired reliability on the system. The industry standard has been 1 in 10 years. But the question remains, is that the program and where we need to be essentially setting the level of reliability target? And that's what we mean essentially when I say target LOLE, it needs to be determined essentially by the IRP. It's not something we're going to be determining here. We can determine something here, but it could essentially provide either more or less reliability and have more or less impact on cost. And so what we're trying to do is to basically say, what level of reliability do we want? And then essentially, let's procure to that target, or let's set up the system to be able to hit that target. And so it's not basically taking a resource. You can take a set of resources and check to see whether or not you're getting the target LOLE that you want. But what you really need, for the most part, is the target LOLE. I don't know if that's helpful or not in terms of
Peter, I just want to clarify. Thank you for that, and I didn't mean to convey disagreement or really even any position. Though I will say I think Calvix is not actually really considered moving away from the LOE target at this time for what that's worth. I was trying to make a more process-oriented point that regardless, completely agnostic to whatever the commission may choose with respect to the LOLE target, there are some process questions about how we would actually operationalize achievement of the LOLE target if the RA reforms result in NQCs that collectively produce an RA-driven portfolio that is more reliable than what you would get if you started with the IRP trying to solve for that given LOE target, regardless of what that target happens to be. I think that puts us in the space, it speaks to the question of over-procurement risk, which is ratepayer advocates is one of our top concerns here. But I didn't mean to comment on the LOE target specifically.
Okay, well, I hear what you're saying, which is that there are interplays in terms of the way the incentives works between the IRP and the RA program in terms of how they're setting up and whether or not one of the issues to some degree I think everybody is struggling with is the targets that are set on the IRP in terms of how are they counting and what are they counting for and how do they match or don't match essentially the way they will count in the RA program. And that by having to meet both the RA requirements and the IRP requirements, that if you're using different counting methodologies or different ways of counting, you may not be able to hit the targets that you think you're hitting, or they may be there's the possibility that they could be inconsistent. So thank you for that.
Okay, so next up we have Doug Karpa, then Brian Beering, and then Jasmine Kwan.
Yeah, hey, Doug Karpa from Peninsula Clean Energy, and actually I wanted to comment very much on the same issue. I do think it's totally clear that whatever the level of the target LOLE is, that's a political question. And I think the right answer actually is 0 times in any governor's term, if we are being honest about it. And given that we saw a loss of load event like 1 in 13 years, and there was a collective meltdown of hair on fire from the commission and the governor, 1 in 10 is politically probably too frequent. We're going to need to have 1 in 20 or something more like that, just because our tolerance for that risk is a lot less than I think industry standard would lead us to believe. So I think that that's, you know, as you're saying, that's a political question. Pick that number based on what they think the people of California will accept. And I actually wanted to same point that actually I think from the perspective of the load serving entity doing the compliance, having the RA compliance feed into the IRP makes a lot of sense to me, because if the RA construct is sufficiently grand, that we would be in a position where if everybody meets their RA targets, we are likely to hit the LOE target, whatever it may be, and which is part of the reason why I think a 24-hour, 24 slices is the way to go, because it does have that granularity. Just looking at peak and net peak leaves out so much of the day and ignores a lot of the energy considerations that we're going to have to meet when we have a lot of storage, that I honestly don't think that would work. And I would envision a scenario where, like Peninsula Clean Energy, we have a slight, a series of slices we have to meet. We assemble our portfolio, we plan our portfolio to meet those slices. And then when we submit all of those into the IRP process, that aggregation, if everything is working well, that really should, when aggregated up, be a reliable system. Yes, there may be excess benefits or greater reliability than we're expecting, but I sort of feel like that's probably a good thing. Considerations, of course, you don't want to hold too much for reliability, but the other issue around cost to consider is if you only have enough resource on the system to exactly hit your target, that last RA resource has huge market power, and we may end up having to pay a lot in RA compliance costs when we're trying to skimp on overall procurement costs. And there's a trade-off between those when markets get really tight. So I think having the overall system be a little bit long is probably preferable from a financial standpoint as well.
Okay, thanks, Doug.
Hi, this is Brian Deering for American Clean Power Association of California. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Well, Peter, thank you for including this slide. This is, the coordination between IRP and the longer term RA reform has been a core issue for ACP California throughout this proceeding and through track 3B2 as well. I guess, the discussion seems largely focused on sort of the programmatic aspects, the sort of the system level planning aspects of trying to coordinate the two programs. And I guess we would encourage the working group participants to really think about this also in the commercial context. As we've noted in the past, and I think as everybody's aware, there is a ton of procurement that is happening and has been called for by the IRP proceeding, and that contracting is happening right now. And those contracts are covering multiple different compliance obligations between IRP, resource adequacy, in many cases RPS as well. And I think one of the concerns that we have is that the changes in the RA program will put a kink in that contracting process, creates uncertainty for that contracting. And I think that's particularly true in the case of wind resources, where we know what the ELCC value is in the now in the IRP process and how that's going to be valued. We have no idea what the exceedance value would really be for most wind resources and how that would be differentiated in geographic areas. And so I think the comment here is really just to encourage you to continue to think about what consistency means in terms of actually meeting the IRP's objectives of having products that are transactable and getting those products transacted on time in accordance with that schedule, and how the potential changes in this process, in the RA process, could affect that. So appreciate your attention to the IRP. Thank you.
Thanks. I agree that the transactability is an important aspect of this, both on both timeframes, both the shorter term RA timeframe as well as the longer term timeframe.
Hi, Peter. This is Jasmine Guan from the CAISO. I just wanted to echo or support that to ensure that the coordination between IRP and RA is needed in the long-term RA framework, as we have commented on this in many of the RA and IRP filings. So, and we think it's important that both of the proceedings have comment inputs, and just wanted to echo that. Thank you.
Thanks, Jasmine.
Okay, I see Kathleen has her hand up.
Great, thank you. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Thanks, Peter, and thanks for everyone for the discussion. Kind of hearkening back to Vistra's proposal for the need, I will say that we think that and I want to echo what Jasmine just said, and if you haven't seen our proposal that's already been put out there, a big part of it is consistency between the CPUC processes, IRP and RA, as well as consistency between CPUC and CAISO. I think that's really important so that all of these programs can better support reliability. I did want to mention that, this is a really difficult conversation, and I understand where I think you're coming from, but I want to get some additional context, if you don't mind, Peter. What we've proposed is that we need a probabilistically determined planning reserve margin through a loss of load equivalent study that is set to achieve a 1 in 10 standard. I don't disagree that there could be politics brought in to say 1 in 10 is not enough. It needs to be, I think I heard you say 1 in 50. But I think everyone can coalesce on taking out politics. At least a 1 in 10 needs to be the reliability threshold that we are striving to achieve. And I believe that's what we're striving to achieve in both the IRP and the RA today. But the RA, because it was calculated so long ago and county rules have changed as well as the fleet, that we're not really achieving a 1 in 10 with our current PRM, which is why it needs to be tuned up. And I want to hear you, if you don't mind, my question is, do you not agree that we at least have a consistent approach between IRP and RA and industry standard if we agree that at least a 1 in 10 needs to be the goal?
So Kathleen, are you asking about do I think that the 1 in 10 is the appropriate goal? I mean, I'm not quite sure or are you pushing that beyond to say that there needs to be much more consistency between the IRP and the RA?
Well, I already hear you.
In terms of things like counting and not just the target reliability.
I already hear you saying the latter.
Okay.
Happy to have you clarify if that's not true, but I think that came out pretty clear to me at least. On the former, it is not clear to me if you're saying that there might be a stricter standard that's preferred, but that you believe a 1 in 10 should be at least what is maintained, or if you're saying that it should be less than a 1 in 10.
Kathleen, let me say that I tend to agree with Doug Carpa, who says that the LOLE, or that the target reliability, is very much a politically determined number. And all I'm saying to some degree is, okay, it may be a politically determined number, and that the politics may change on that, but what we need to some degree is more specificity as to what it should be so we can essentially plan accordingly, both in the IRP and in the RA framework. And so it's not necessarily saying that whether it needs to be at least a 1 in 10 or higher. I think for the most part, that's much more, no, we need to basically have a decision about what it is and get direction from the commission as to what we think the target level of reliability should be.
Okay, that's a helpful clarification. I think our view is that a part of this workshop and this process is to provide that recommendation. And our proposal is a PRM that is probabilistically determined through a loss of load equivalent study that achieves a 1 in 10 standard. If an IRP, if there were some commission direction that they would prefer a higher standard and would align it across these processes, Vistra is happy to take that back, and we encourage and just invite the CPUC to let us know if that is something they would like us to consider in our proposal. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Kathleen. I see no other hands raised. We had lunch scheduled from 12 to 12:30. It's now basically 12:10. So I'll open it to a question of, do we want to take the full 30 or take 20 and come back at 12:30?
Yeah, let me say, Sergio, that we still have a few more slides to go, and so we're not done with the presentation. So and I don't know how long it'll take us to make it through those slides, just to give people a sense of sort of how much more we have prepared to cover. I think to some degree that I think the discussion this morning has been very robust, and a lot of views have been expressed, and I think that's been a good discussion. I want to continue having that discussion to the extent we need to after lunch. So I might prefer a little longer lunch break just to be able to get the full half hour in, but I'm willing to go with what other people want.
Sure, I think that's a good idea. Alan, do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm always going to err on the side of giving people more of a break than less.
I'm right there with you. So let's come back at 12:40 to carry on with the presentation. And with that, thank you so much and enjoy your meals.